right to protest far right.
The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal.
You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite.
Welcome to Unscripted with Daniel, your free, independent news source for Valparaiso and Indiana politics. Welcome to episode 2 of Unscripted with Daniel. On this episode, I talked to Benjamin Studebaker about his book, Legitimacy and Liberal Democracies. This book is about embedded democracies, in which he posits America is one of them, meaning that it's very difficult for us to actually achieve any change in our country because of competing interests. On the cover of this book, there's a hydra. I have him explain what the meaning of this hydra is.
Yeah, the hydra sits on the cover of the book, and the hydra is a metaphor for the liberal democratic state in the chronic crisis that I propose that it's stuck in, the tar pit. So we start with the idea of a dinosaur in a tar pit. A dinosaur in a tar pit is not menaced by some other dinosaur. It's not that liberal democracy is competing with some other type of regime. Fascism, communism, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are gone. There's no other kind of regime in the world today that seems credible to most Americans or most Western Europeans. So what are we talking about then?
Right.
When we say that there's a crisis of democracy? It's not a fight between regime types. Rather, it's democracy having gotten itself into a mess that it can't really get itself out of. And in its attempts to get itself out of that mess, the wriggling and the struggling that it does, it tends to get itself stuck in deeper. But what I want to suggest democracy can do in this situation is that, unlike a diplodocus that only has one very long neck, it can grow additional necks like a hydra. So it can attempt to justify itself and to convince its population of its continued vitality through a large number of different narratives that it proliferates all at the same time. The trouble is that these narratives conflict with each other. So like the jumble of heads on the hydra, they pull in different directions, they attack each other, they froth around, and the fighting among the heads tends to take all of our attention. Meanwhile, the beast is stuck in the tar pit, and the more the heads wrestle with each other, the more stuck in the tar pit it becomes. It's as the different political actors who claim to speak for the state. You can also think of the heads as the different narratives, the different values that different political actors invoke. So when the state takes a course of action, people will justify that course of action in reference to lots of what I call legitimating abstractions. These are open-ended concepts like peace, prosperity, order, liberty, equality, representation, God, nature. Big concepts could mean lots of different things. So when the state takes an action, one of these abstractions is invoked to justify that action, and then there has to be some sort of effort to show that the abstraction actually does relate to the action in some way. So I call this the conceptualization. So in conceptualizing an abstraction, you make it specific and you make it relate to a specific course of action. So for instance, if the president does a set of tariffs, the president claims that these tariffs will contribute to the prosperity of the country. So he invokes some notion of prosperity, attempts to connect it to the tariffs, and then tries to show in some specific, more precise way that there's a relationship between the policy and that abstract goal. Meanwhile, the president's opponents will criticize him, not just on the grounds that they think that the tariffs don't actually fulfill prosperity, as Trump understands it, But they'll also claim that perhaps prosperity should be understood in a totally different way, that it would involve completely different conditions other than those the president is going for. And beyond that, they might also claim that prosperity shouldn't be the principal goal of the policy, that something like justice or equality or some other value ought to have priority. And then they might conceptualize justice or equality in some particular way that might be different from the way the president, if he were to talk about justice or equality, would conceptualize those abstractions. So when you've got this hydra going, you have lots and lots of different political actors who are throwing out lots of abstractions that they're conceptualizing in lots of different ways in relation to lots of different conflicting forms of action. So you get this big, big frothing argument among people who don't understand any of the terms in the same way and are invoking language that will often seem similar on behalf of completely different causes. Well, so for instance, we could take any issue up in relation to this.
Right.
So for housing, some people think that the goal of housing policy should be to make housing affordable to large numbers of people. Other people think it's inappropriate for the state to try to intervene in the cost of housing, that that's something that has to be generated through a market process that they regard as free in some sense. So they value freedom, which they conceptualize in relationship to a housing market. So they want the housing market to be free, and for them, that's the priority. Other people have a conceptualization of, say, equality with regard to access to housing, or prosperity with regard to people being able to acquire housing, or perhaps they would understand freedom in a different way, freedom in terms of perhaps a right to housing that would be an expression of human freedom or something. These would be different ways of bringing human values into a discussion of attempting to justify various forms of housing policy. What I think is characteristic of the crisis that we're in is that any particular policy area that you raise, you will get a huge number of different kinds of arguments with lots and lots of different abstractions in play. And you won't be able to litigate this at the level of arguments. You will not be able to make arguments that will convince people to coalesce around one particular view or narrative, which makes it very difficult to move policy. I propose in this book something I call deep pluralism. So in previous periods where there's a real possibility that your regime, your political system, could be outcompeted by some other regime or system, there's a real possibility that there could be a revolution, a revolt, a civil conflict, because large parts of your population are willing to seriously entertain dying for some other kind of political system. In these kinds of contexts, disagreement has very serious consequences. If you have serious, deep disagreement over a long period of time, you'll get major political violence. I argue that today, we don't have this kind of commitment to other regimes. And because we don't have this kind of commitment to, say, Soviet-style communism or fascism on the part of large parts of the population, disagreement doesn't have consequences in the way that it did at earlier points, or was thought to have at earlier points in, say, the 20th century, or in other countries in other times and places. And because of this, disagreement is able to develop. It's allowed to continue to grow over time and to spread into more areas of life, including into epistemology, into our theory of what counts as knowledge. And this causes us to disagree even about how we would establish what facts are. It makes the disagreement much, much harder to resolve. And it also makes it harder for anyone to even attempt to build any sort of opposition movement, because the disagreement will begin to infect and destroy any attempt at forming a coherent opposition movement. So it affects not just the defenders of liberal democracy, it also affects those on the right and those on the left who try to articulate some kind of alternative. They're not able to generate any kind of cohesive unity around a particular alternative conception. So the disagreement just spirals and spirals and spills into more and more areas of life, and this produces lockups and impasses.
And okay, so I maybe can see this as far as like the disagreement on fundamental ways in which we can get to knowledge, and like those subsets of people who may believe in like the flat earth, or people who are sort of another sector of Republican politics is ones that are going towards Christian nationalism. That's another sect, an argument of how government should be established. And then there's like the conspiracy, which you could say is, of course, the flat Earth too, but like the Jeffrey Epstein constituency, who are also fighting to get that sort of truth, and their legitimating story that brought them into office was, we're going to get down to the truth of what happened with Epstein. And now the narrative, the legitimation story, is sort of unraveling because of the head guy, Trump, is sort of backing off that. It seems that way. Those are conflicting heads just within the Republican Party, right? And
yeah, and part of how political movements try to carry on in the face of all of this disagreement is by talking out of many different sides of their mouth at once. So a movement like the Trump campaign will have an enormous number of different legitimation stories that it throws out as justification narratives for itself. And it doesn't particularly care which ones you pick up as long as you vote for it. So it can have lots and lots of different narratives, and any one of those narratives can be discarded without really posing any kind of fundamental threat to the political movement. This is the kind of populist strategy that became popular in the 80s out of the Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe book that came out back then. And it revolves around keeping a politician or a movement open as a kind of floating signifier so people can fill it with whatever they want. The difficulty is, once somebody is in office, they can't act in a bunch of different ways all at the same time. You have to ultimately do something in particular. And whatever you do, it will spoil the hopes and dreams of various parts of your coalition who were imagining that you were going to mean various different things. So once politicians get into office, they have a difficult time keeping these coalitions together. And as a consequence of this, you notice that the approval ratings for both Trump and Biden typically sit in the low 40s, aren't able to go very much up from that. But very briefly, at the very beginning of the term, there's a moment where they're over 50% as a significant part of the coalition imagines it's going to get something. So legitimacy and ideology are, for me, kind of two faces of the same concept. So a legitimation story is an attempt to justify the actions of the state in relation to some set of values. Right. Ideology critique can focus on the same kind of narrative, but frame it as a device for manipulating or tricking or deceiving people. And so one of my claims is that all legitimation stories also appear to some people as ideological narratives. And that whether something is a legitimation story or an ideological narrative, it's very difficult to establish a consensus about that. Because for different parts of the population at any given time, the same stories will function as both one and the other.
Can't any legitimation story fall on some ideology? How can it not fall onto an ideology, in other words?
Right. It's a double-sided concept.
I see.
Legitimacy is the side which takes seriously the idea that the action really could be justified by that story or narrative, that the values that are being invoked could be real, important, serious values that ought to be taken seriously. Whereas the ideology side emphasizes the constructed, potentially deceptive character of all ways of describing human values, of all invocations of human values in relation to coercive action. So both of these ways of talking can occur at the same time and about the same things.
I see. It can both be true, and they could be trying to move the public in a certain direction.
It depends on the point of view that you adopt with respect to that particular abstraction and the way that abstraction has been conceptualized.
So what he's saying is that there are all these different legitimation stories, and for each legitimation story, there are multiple arguments in which can be argued against the legitimation story as something that is not correct, or something that is silly to be approaching, or is ideological and not grounded in reason. So they're all fighting. So basically, none of them can succeed because they're all arguing against each other. If it were the case, though, that we could agree on something, then maybe we could actually get out of this. That's possible, right? But what would we actually unify around? So, in this next clip, I ask Benjamin whether Trump is something different, whether his use of unitary executive theory would be something that would allow more change to actually happen, less gridlock, and more just action should theoretically allow things to actually change, right? Well, that's not the answer I got. Let's go ahead and jump in.
No, they're not getting out of the tar pit. What happens is you get disagreement about what democracy means, frustration with the fact that democracy is not able to get out of the tar pit, various kinds of procedural reform proposals that are supposed to make it easier for the state to act. So this can be attempts to centralize power around the executive branch. It can be attempts to reduce the power of the state governments versus the federal government. Mm-hmm. It can be attempts to clean out the judiciary by impeaching some of the members, expanding the size of the court. It can be about getting rid of the Senate. All of these different things have been thrown out in language by people on all different sides of the political aisle. It can be about strengthening elected officials against the permanent bureaucracy. It can be about strengthening the permanent bureaucracy against the elected officials. There's been loads and loads of things that have been thrown out. What is universal is that people will say that the procedural reforms that are proposed that they don't like are authoritarian. And the reason that people will say this is because the one thing everybody still agrees on, more or less, apart from people like Curtis Yarvin, is that authoritarianism is very bad and leads to something like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, which is something we all agree that we don't want. Now, there are some people who will rhetorically and ironically, in an unserious way, make gestures in the direction of Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. And then these people are used as examples by their opponents of, see, it turns out that the people who have been trying to save democracy are really committed to destroying it. But the overwhelming bulk of people on every side of this debate think of themselves as committed to saving democracy from other people who are looking to capture it or lock it up or prevent it from being fluid or dynamic in some way, shape, or form. And so this is the case in terms of Democrats accusing the Republicans of trying to centralize power around the executive or trying to centralize power around electeds at the expense of the permanent bureaucrats. It's also the case when the Republicans accuse the Democrats of trying to gut the Senate or trying to gut the Supreme Court or trying to centralize power around a permanent bureaucracy.
Yeah, okay. So, in other words, it's nothing to worry about. We're just stuck in this
well, it's
tar
something
pit.
To worry about. It's a different kind of thing to worry about. It's not a threat of authoritarianism. It's an impasse that is causing us all to look for different ways out and then to misrecognize each other as fascists or communists instead of trying to cooperate to get out of the pit. We're not able to cooperate because the disagreement is too deep, and we immediately accuse each other of being various kinds of bad things.
I see. Okay. So there's no way out.
Yeah, we're on a path that is really going to work on the basis of institutional inertia now. People aren't able to recognize each other as having the politics that they in fact have. They accuse each other of being various things that they are not. Yeah, and the same thing happened when Obama was president, and he was called an Obamunist and accused of being a Stalinist or something. We're just seeing another version of that now.
Are there any other examples of a embedded democracy like our own?
Yes. So I think embedded democracies, so these are democracies where there really aren't sincere, committed, non-ironic communists, fascists, monarchists in any kind of large number with any kind of organized capacity to threaten the regime. I think that this would include democracies that have had their democratic institutions for at least 100 years. So it would include states like the UK, many of the Scandinavian countries, Australia, Canada, a number of different countries. Then you have countries that have been democracies since, say, the 1940s. These are countries that it's less clear whether they would have this level of embeddedness, countries like Germany or Italy. Then you have countries that are very recent democracies, countries that became democracies after the end of the Cold War, where middle-aged people remember being teenagers in an authoritarian period. Those countries, I think, are not at all likely to be embedded. And I think that their societies are very different. So, for instance, Hungary or Poland, these are very different kinds of countries that have only very recently adopted democratic institutions and don't have any kind of deep tradition of being democratic. In the United States, for instance, we don't have a notion of what it means to be American outside of commitment to the political system. People in the United States are completely different. Anything that you would try to raise as something that people in the United States have in common, apart from a commitment to the Constitution or to the political system, it would be very hard to substantiate that. People try, but attempts to make these kinds of claims are very controversial and usually generate a lot of opposition from whatever direction they might be made in. In a country like the UK, it's less focused on a positive recognition of the democratic character of Britishness and more focused around a sense that other systems have been tried in other places, but they've not been successful. There's the old Winston Churchill quote that democracy is the worst system of government except for all others that have been tried. If your system has been in operation for 100 or 200 years and you've seen other systems come and go in other places, people try things and it hasn't worked out, it tends to produce a skepticism toward new political systems, new ideas. And in the UK, there's a deep skepticism of other kinds of regimes.
I see. Now, you said for Germany that it's not clear whether they would become an embedded democracy or not. What separates them? Is it cultural, or is it the setup of their government itself that makes it less likely that they become embedded in their democracy?
They haven't been a democracy for as long. So in the case of West Germany, they've been a democracy since the end of the war. And they're getting, I think, up to the point at which you might be able to characterize them as potentially embedded. I think it's a question whether West Germany is embedded. East Germany, however, was not a democracy until quite recently. And you can see the effect of this if you look at the voting pattern in Germany. The Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party in Germany, does much, much better in East Germany than it does in West Germany. In East Germany, it can win regional elections. It can win German state-level elections, like in Thuringia. But it's much less competitive in West Germany, where the democratic institutions and structures have been around for much longer.
So, in other words, what you're saying is that it's just a matter of time before it becomes embedded? Or is there other influences other than just time and democracy?
Well, it's possible for a crisis to happen early enough that the country has not yet become embedded, and for people to respond to that crisis by pursuing an authoritarian regime. So, for instance, in a place like Hungary, how do you respond to something like the global economic crisis of 2008? If you're a new democracy, it's much more likely that you would consider more authoritarian responses, because your population has not ruled those out of the realm of possibility, remembers these kinds of policies being enforced at a time when many of the people of the country were young and vital and having a good time. So there can be nostalgia for that kind of regime in that kind of context. So there's a possibility that these countries would fail to become embedded because they would have a crisis that would cause them to go authoritarian at an early point. But once you have been a democracy for a long time and the possibility of really seriously putting your life on the line on behalf of something else has dropped out of the picture, once you can't imagine putting yourself in harm's way on behalf of a different political system, not seriously, then the crisis will have different effects. Instead of the disagreement producing a revolutionary upsurge in which there's a confrontation between the state and people in the street, you instead get something else entirely. And you see this, for instance, in the No Kings protests, which occurred generally on the weekend and in the morning. and often they're legal, and they're very careful to not be disruptive to commerce. These are not the kinds of protests that challenge the state and compel the state to potentially call out the troops on the protesters to get people to go back to work. They're not like the protests that occurred in, say, Egypt in 2011, where there's a real possibility that the regime could collapse as a consequence of the protests.
Yeah. So yeah, that definitely does set it apart. So it's almost like a historical memory and cultural, how people view democracy. Has it worked in the past, and have we had an authoritarian in the past and also had success? Like China, for example, would be one where it's like, why would we even want democracy? You know, we have President Xi able to accomplish our needs in that way. So, okay, I sort of understand now how that works. How do we know a country has hit rock bottom of the settling stage? Yeah.
Oh, yes. So this is in relation to, I threw out 3 different kinds of responses to discontent. One is to try to solve the problem, so to try to fix the system in such a way that your problem goes away. Another is to settle. It's to lower your expectations and accept that you're not going to get what you want. And then I proposed sinking as something that happens when you get into a vicious cycle of moving back and forth between solving and settling. So you try to solve the problem, you can't solve the problem, you become frustrated, you attempt to give up. You find that the problem is deteriorating while you're trying to give up in such a way that you're bothered by the continuous deterioration. And so therefore you try again to solve the problem, and then you don't solve the problem. In fact, the things you do to try to solve the problem often make it worse, and then this disillusions you again. And so you get into this cycle of activation and deactivation politically, where you go from being very engaged in politics to not engaged to very engaged again. And all that happens is that the problem deteriorates and gets worse as you go back and forth between different mental states.
So there is no bottom. In other words, it just keeps sinking downwards.
Well, people keep supposing, how can it possibly go on? Won't there be at some point a breaking point, a civil war, a coup, a revolution? But what we find is that people are not willing to sacrifice themselves for those kinds of things because there is no other regime that they believe in. So this waiting for people to all of a sudden throw down their lives on behalf of something else never happens. The something else never comes. And what we discover is that things can actually get a lot worse very slowly, very gradually over a long period of time. And people will still prefer to continue with their ordinary day-to-day lives rather than take real risk, put themselves in a position where they could be killed or they could be badly beaten. Very few people are willing to do this. Certainly not at scale, certainly not in an organized way.
Right. I guess, how do you view January 6th in that lens? Because if they were successful, this would be a very different country, I would think, because politicians would be killed. They wanted to basically kill some politicians. It didn't happen.
What stands out to me about that, so you have all the people who voted for Trump. Then you've got all the people who think that the election was stolen, or they don't agree with the result, or they think in some way the result has been rigged. Then out of that group of people, you've got the percentage of them that actually come to the Capitol to try to do something about it. Then you've got the small percentage of those people who actually enter the building. They put themselves in position to enter the building, and they actually get in. So this is the most extreme part of the movement. It's the people who are not only sure that the election was stolen, but they put themselves in position to get into the building, and given the chance, they actually enter the building. So they take the risk of committing the crime of entering the building. What did these people do when they got into the building? They were shocked that they were able to get into the building. They started taking pictures. They were entertained by having gotten into the building. And many of them were surprised to discover after the fact that it was highly illegal and that they would be prosecuted. They didn't kill large numbers of people. And the overwhelming bulk of the people who entered the building had no illusions about the possibility of killing any significant number of people. So to me, what that tells you is that even when you're dealing with the extreme fringe in this country, the people who not only would come to DC, but who would put themselves in position to enter the building and actually go in, you have people who are not ultimately willing to, in some kind of planned, serious, organized way, attempt to take the state.
Yep. Not yet. Not yet. And I guess time will tell how frustrated people will get. And like you said, maybe like discontent can breed a sort of action. But if we have so many differences between each other, it's hard to, like you say, form a coalition to actually do something.
And there's got to be real belief in that something else, of the kind of belief that people used to have when revolutions were staged. And it's one thing to parrot, the lines or the narratives of communists or fascists, to use that kind of language. It's another thing to actually put yourself at personal risk to try to bring about a different political system because you think that that system will make life radically better.
Yeah, it is radically better. Different. Yeah.
And that's what they believed. They thought that if they created a different kind of system, that this would make everything amazing, that you would go from zero to hero, that the world would be turned from a black world into a white world, or vice versa.
Right. And yeah, so I don't see that happening either. It's not easy to form a coalition like that. I mean, there might be like this, the closest thing to like a nationwide and both party bipartisan wide issue that we have right now is the Epstein story, but that is not necessarily even political unless you pair that with something like it's the billionaires. We need to hold them accountable and tax them more. They're not doing good things with their money. If we formed a coalition on that, maybe it's very unlikely, but maybe.
Well, we see that there's a lot of anti-billionaire sentiment in both political parties. There's a sense of swamp or corruption, or the system doesn't work appropriately because of very rich people. Widespread ideas about that. The question is, what do you positively do in response to that feeling? Can you get people to agree on a particular response? And that's very difficult, especially because when you ask people, what is the problem with the rich? Is it that some rich people are corrupt and they steal and they bribe? Is it that rich people are involved in some sort of organized conspiratorial organization that is running the world behind scenes? Is it something like capitalism, a structural, impersonal thing that isn't reducible to any particular people? There's totally different understandings of what is the problem of the rich, insofar as that is something people would center.
And that is the problem, because some think it's just some sort of conspiracy, whereas others are saying basically they're not paying enough in taxes and they should spread their wealth. Like that, because we're not on a unified front in policy, that's the problem with, even though a lot of people agree that there might be issues with billionaires, it's like, what are the problems? We need to agree on that. But this was a great discussion. Thank you, Benjamin, for telling me about your book, Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me, Daniel. It was great.
Yeah. Okay, so that was a great interview, and I appreciate Benjamin Studebaker sitting down with me and talking with me about that. Now, you know what? I can't be blamed for feeling a little sad by the news that it's so difficult to actually make change in this society. Well, I guess I kind of already knew. But I wanted to get another opinion, and not just get another opinion, but ask also how can we make change, even though it is difficult in our society? So I reached out to people at VU, some experts at VU, and I was able to get Gregg Johnson, a professor of political science and the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Liberal Arts and Sciences. And through his busy schedule, he was able to sit down with me. So let's go ahead and jump in. I basically asked him, is it as bad as it seems, as is presented by Benjamin Studebaker in his book?
If we're looking at liberal democracies, Western democracies plus Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the idea that you are going to get wholesale major change, radical change, is unlikely. That most change in democracies tends to be what I think of as small c conservative change. It's incremental, it's small, it's at the margins. And the only time that you tend to have major change or radical change is during times of crises. And these crises could be economic challenges. So the Great Depression was a time of great change. Post-World War II was a time of great change. The other possibility tends to be during foreign invasion or during war that you can see major changes. And so this doesn't necessarily address economic policy per se, but after 9/11, for example, you saw a radical change in U.S. policy, much greater expansion of the security state and intelligence gathering and intelligence agencies. So you do see radical changes at times of crises. Otherwise, what you tend to get in democracies is elected leaders are afraid to make big changes, partly because their populations don't usually like big changes. If you look at the Obama administration's chief accomplishment was Obamacare, or the ACA. And the ACA was a fairly substantial change, but it wasn't radical change. It was an expansion of the government's role in healthcare, but it wasn't like we got single payer or Medicare for all as a reform. So all of this is a long, complicated way of saying that, you know, we tend to see smaller incremental changes from year to year. Even when we see larger changes, it tends to be in times of crises, or those changes may not seem radical, at least in a comparative perspective, because we end up in a situation where we're building off of already existing policies and structures and systems. So I don't know that it's hopeless. I would say that if you are praying for radical change, and I would argue that right now the Trump administration is attempting to implement radical change, that whether you agree or disagree with the Trump administration's attempts at radical change, there certainly are attempts at radical change in terms of how budget funds are spent, how government workers are employed, with a push seemingly to return to more of a spoils system of government, and in many ways a return to government policies and procedures of long ago, or in a way that sort of ignores established precedents. So you could say, oh, well, we're in a time of crisis. Most political scientists would not argue that the United States is in a time of crisis in terms of economics or in terms of being subject to a foreign invasion or engaged in a major global conflict. So it is a little bit unusual, but there's much about the Trump administration that's unusual, right? This is not somebody who came up through the political system, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So that's my initial response.
I see. And so with that being the case, is that type of radical difference, that radical change that he's trying to make, something that obviously, from my perspective, it's not something that we should want, but maybe, just maybe, it'll allow the executive to function better, even though it's throwing out all the rules. Maybe it means for the next candidate, maybe it's a Democrat, will they take those precedents and then allow even more radical change in that direction? But it sort of is like, do we want to play into that game? I don't know.
As a political scientist who spent the early part of my career studying how democratic institutions function or fail to function, what you see with the Trump administration, you saw with the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2021, this was certainly been, ramped up in the second Trump term. But what you've seen is sort of a move towards a more radical view. So there's been a long argument in conservative circles about the unitary executive. And essentially the executive should be able to do more or less what they want, how they want. If you study the constitutional history or constitutional law, which are not my primary areas of expertise, but nonetheless, if you study them at all, you'll see that Congress was the chief policymaker, certainly up until the Great Depression and World War II. And you saw a massive expansion of the U.S. government during the Depression and World War II in order to fight the Depression and World War II. And you saw Congress cede much of its power to the executive branch for the execution of those efforts. You continued to see Congress, I would argue, abdicate many of their responsibilities in the post-World War II era, right? How many wars have we officially declared since the end of World War II? The Trump administration has taken that line of thinking in conservative legal circles of the unitary executive and basically amped it up to 11, right? They've turned the volume up to 11 and said, we have been bound by court decisions, we've been bound by congressional inaction, and so we're just going to do what we want. If you believe in the U.S. constitutional structure and you think that that's a good structure, then we have long lauded the founders for a separation of powers, and we have 3 co-equal branches, and the different branches have different roles. If you want a government to be more efficient, then the U.S. system is not built for efficiency, right? The U.S. government is built to maintain the status quo. It is very hard, given the structure of the U.S. government. We literally, our founders were afraid of concentrating power in the hands of one person because of their experience with the British Crown. And so they spread power out. They spread it out across 3 branches of government, plus the various states. They created a federal system. So the U.S. system is very unlike, say, the British system. So I find it interesting that Studebaker is talking about the UK system. The UK system has basically no checks and balances. That if the British government today decided it wanted to eliminate the National Health Service, they could do that. They are empowered to make radical changes to their system of government. There is it's a unicameral legislature. The executive is selected by the legislature, so there's no separation of powers between the executive and the legislature. So if the British system, really wanted radical change, and you could argue that you got radical change in 2016. Now, it took several years for that to come to fruition, but the British public voted narrowly in favor of Brexit, exiting the European Union. I don't remember the exact vote totals, but it was, 50% plus a little bit voted for leaving the European Union, and that's a pretty radical shift. Yeah. The British government can do that in ways that it's much harder to do in the United States. So if you're going back to your question about can future Democratic administrations use the precedent of the Trump administration, potentially yes. I would say the caveat is that Democratic administrations will be bound by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is overwhelmingly controlled by conservative justices. 6 of them were appointed by Republican administrations, 3 by Democratic administrations. There's a well-developed literature on how Supreme Court justices, the presidents who appoint them, influence their voting patterns and behaviors. You will occasionally get a Republican nominee who will vote in a more liberal fashion. On particular cases, the liberal justices may vote in a more what's seen as conservative fashion. But generally speaking, the Supreme Court would act as a check on any Democratic administration, and a Democratic administration, unless you had somebody who was equally as outside of the system as Donald Trump was, a Democratic administration is unlikely to just ignore the Supreme Court if they say, no, you can't do that. The Andrew Jackson approach of, are they going to send their army down to enforce their ruling? I find it difficult to believe that a Democratic administration would do that. What a Democratic administration might do, though, is say, you know what, we're going to pack the court. We're going to just flip the court on its head, and we're going to nominate 6 Democratic justices, and now we're going to have a 9-6 advantage or something like that. Yeah. Getting that accomplished would be difficult, though, in the U.S. system. Sorry, I'm going in a lot of different directions, probably.
Totally fine.
Again, the U.S. system is designed to protect the status quo. If a Democratic administration said, well, we're going to expand the court, assuming they could get the House to pass it, and then they could get the Senate to pass it, maybe you could get that done. But the Senate, one, has the filibuster, and so you would probably have to get the Republicans to eliminate the filibuster before the Democrats would eliminate it, number one. Number two, the Senate represents land. It doesn't represent people. And so the Senate disproportionately represents rural states over the interests of more urbanized states, or more populous states, if you will. Yeah. And less populous states tend to be more conservative. They tend to be more rural, and so you get the overrepresentation of rural conservative interests in the Senate as American politics is currently constituted. Mm-hmm. That may not always be the case, but that's the current constellation.
I see. Even if, say, a lot of people move to cities, then it maybe even further ruralizes the Senate or the, right?
Yes. The book, it sounds like, is dealing with 2 important issues. One is in a pluralistic society, meaning there are lots of different interests and lots of different groups. Mm-hmm. Trying to aggregate interests into one single policy outcome is extremely difficult, if not impossible. There's really no small d democratic way to do this, right? Using democracy, how do we amalgamate 300 million opinions? It's basically impossible, right?
Right.
So how do we do this? Well, we form social organizations, we join interest groups, we join political parties. Those are the three principal ways that we can achieve change. And so through particularly social movements and interest groups, you mentioned unions in particular, you can have an effect. You can get change. Think about the non-controversial issue of abortion, right? Obviously, the non-controversial issue of abortion.
Yeah.
We've had interest groups fighting about abortion basically since the Roe v. Wade decision, probably beforehand, but it wasn't much on the radar screen of interest groups prior to Roe v. Wade because it hadn't shown up in the policy landscape in such a clear, stark way. So post Roe v. Wade, you have the emergence of anti-abortion groups. If you want to call them right-to-life groups or anti-abortion groups, I leave that to your listener. But you end up in a situation where this is an issue that anti-abortion groups spent my entire lifetime, basically, fighting to overturn Roe v. Wade. It was a 50-year struggle, and then they achieved, with the Supreme Court ruling, they achieved this radical change.
Yeah.
Right? And so it may take an interest group 30, 40, 50 years to achieve their goal. You may agree or disagree with that goal, but if you're looking at particular issues, say, I'm of course blanking on the historian's last name. His first name's Rutger. He's Belgian, I think. Is he Belgian? Dutch. No, he's Dutch. So there's this Dutch historian. I can't remember the last name off the top of my head. I apologize. He wrote a book some years ago, and in it was sort of a pop history, and he made, here are 10 reasonable policy arguments of why we could do things to make people's lives better. And so one of the things that he included was a minimum living wage. Essentially, we are rich enough in advanced industrial democracies that we could tax people in such a way that every month you would get, $1,000 a month or something to use as you see fit. And this would provide some minimal level of comfort.
Yeah.
He was also arguing this would be a way to greatly simplify the way that governments work, because right now you've seen this play out with, say, SNAP benefits and cuts to SNAP benefits, or changes to Medicare or Medicaid, really Medicaid probably, I guess, not Medicare, of people have to prove that they qualify, and they've got to fill out a lot of paperwork, and they've got to go to meetings and so on and so forth. This historian was saying, if we give everybody a minimum living wage and they just spend the money as they see fit, if they want to buy health care, they can buy health care. If they want to pay for rent, they can pay for rent. We could eliminate all those government programs, essentially. Greatly simplify the way the government works, and people just spend the money the way they want to. There have been some experiments that have been done on this topic. Seattle and Denver ran one back in, I think, as far back as the 1970s. And generally speaking, the research, it's pretty limited, but it does show that this is a pretty simple way to improve people's lives. Now, you got to tax people and there's redistribution involved, but this would be a radical change. I don't see any interest groups forming and pushing for this, even though it would be a relatively efficient way to potentially massively improve lots of people's lives. People like me would have to pay a lot more in taxes, but I would also get a chunk of that back, right? Nobody gets excluded from getting the minimum living wage, right? It's structured like Social Security.
Yeah.
Everybody who qualifies gets it.
Yeah.
So anybody who's a man, woman, or child living in the U.S. who, maybe they exclude legal permanent residents or something, maybe it's only U.S. citizens who qualify or something. But regardless, it would be a relatively straightforward thing. In terms of unions, you had briefly mentioned this in your phone call with me, and in your text you mentioned unions. We haven't seen substantial growth, and in fact we've only seen decline in unions for, at this point, 50, 60 years, really. Unions have really taken it on the chin. There have been some efforts to revive unions. The Biden administration did take steps to try to revive unions, largely unsuccessful. The Trump administration, I haven't followed all the ins and outs, but I know that they have done some stuff that would basically eliminate public sector unions at the federal government, except for law enforcement and firefighters, essentially. And so if you're looking for unions as a way to bring about change, we would need a radically different union movement. And this is a bit of a catch-22, right? That in order to get stronger unions, you would need pro-union government officials to pass policies that make unions more powerful, or you would need such a debilitating economic crisis, right? Even 2008 wasn't enough to really radically reinvigorate unions. There was some financial legislation, but some of that's even been walked back. The Obama administration, I think only one person went to jail for financial malfeasance in the wake of the Great Recession. And so if you can't get radical change from the Great Recession, I don't know what is going to lead to a reinvigoration of the union movement in the United States, apart from economic collapse.
Yeah.
And there are reasons to think that would be bad, right? You might, 100 years down the road, have a better outcome, but when it's happening, life was pretty miserable during the Great Depression, and it was good for unions, but not so great for the time that people were living through it.
I see. So maybe don't go for that. But you did mention that radical change that conservatives did accomplish through Roe v. Wade. And one of the things that he covers in the book is that in order to have any type of radical change, you have to be able to almost stake your life on it a bit. And I feel like there's definitely a lot of emotion behind. You said it was uncontroversial issue. It's very controversial, but that passion that people have for it, people need to have for the policies that they want to have done. And I guess it has to feel like a matter of survival for people. And for them, it's a life, and we're saving lives. So maybe that's key for Democrats, for anyone wanting to accomplish some sort of radical policy like a universal basic income, like you were talking about. And the reality is that it would be saving lives. And so we have to believe it and almost preach it in a way.
And beyond preaching it,
yeah.
you need to organize.
And organize.
Right. And this is one of the great successes of the union movement, right? The organized workers, and they were able to ensure and gain real economic power during particularly World War II and the 1950s and 1960s. And you saw this, I mentioned the anti-abortion movement. You could also think about the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement, this is not my area of expertise, but people were willing to sacrifice up to their lives in order to achieve basic legal equity in the United States. Now, I'm not saying that that equity was achieved per se, but at least the law on the books after the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Acts were passed, the law said Americans, regardless of race or ethnicity, are equal. And we have to, we can't use a poll tax to keep black people from voting. We can't use literacy tests to keep black people from voting. And organization, at the end of the day, is the key to change. And I don't know if you've watched the TV show Andor.
I haven't.
But it is an excellent treatise on the way that authoritarian regimes work and how they can devolve into fascist regimes or really amp up the fascism depending on your perspective on the government. I know it's a Star Wars show, but it's very well done. And in it, one of the main characters who is trying to organize the rebellion tells one of the other characters, we lose, and we lose, and we lose, and we lose, and we lose. But all the time he's organizing so that they can win. And so if you want change, you have to be prepared to organize, to preach, to organize, and to lose, and to lose, and to lose, and to lose until you win. I think that character's advice is spot on for how change happens.
Yeah. Well, I think we got a lot out of this interview. Thank you, Gregg, for coming in. And maybe we'll see you next time for some other contributions on different topics. But thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
You're very welcome. Okay, thank you so much, Gregg Johnson, for sitting down with me. And I've learned a lot of things that we can actually do, even though we're in an embedded democracy. He makes it clear that it is possible, though it would be hard, but we basically have to be organized, very organized, meaning we have to have the right people in the right place at the right time in order to get the policies that we want done. We have to have the same zeal. Anti-abortion people are fighting to save lives, and we too, for our policies, are fighting to save lives too. So it's important to believe it and put your, stake your life on it to a certain extent so that we can help people, because, at the end of the day, that's what we believe our policies to do. And if you want your policy, or if you want to help people, then you have to have that same zeal, that their lives on the line. I think that's important. So, all right, with all that said, that was episode 2 of Unscripted with Daniel. Hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me on Unscripted with Daniel. And if you're watching on WVOP, be sure to tell a friend about this great broadcast. And if you're listening on YouTube, then subscribe and like this video. Thanks so much. See you next time.